of our American government. In the early days, political debates were held in theaters and lecture halls across America, like this one, drawing large crowds from every corner of society. Now we engage with the candidates through TV screens and Twitter feeds, watching as the elections unfold.
The spotlight may be on the top contenders, but it's really about the people. Today we're going to talk about our role in this important election process.
By understanding where elections came from and how they work, you can help determine who will be in the room when our nation's most important decisions are being made. Today's lawmakers are tomorrow's history shapers. I'm David Barton.
I'm Tim Barton, and this is Elections. In this series, we're going to be talking about elections. And specifically today, we're going to talk about forms of government and ask the question, what form of government is the best? And what form of government do we have in America? Because I hear some people say America's a democracy, but I've read some documents that seem to say America's a republic. So what's the difference between a republic and a democracy, or does it even really matter? To answer those questions, we want to back up and see, well, what does the Bible say about this? And what can we learn from history about the difference and maybe the best forms of government?
When you look back into the Bible, we start with God made man, Adam, and then God made Eve. And so we have man and woman, which creates a family. And so from that, we have man and woman and a family, and now we're into Genesis 3. And as you continue to go through Genesis 3 and 4 and 5, you find that there's more and more people. And so as the world grows, they have relationship with each other, but it's not always good, especially in the way they behave. So you see there's a lot of murder. There's a lot of theft, no respect for private property, a lot of rape, no respect for individuals. And by the time you get to Genesis 6, God says, this is not good at all. We need to wipe everything out and start again. So here comes Noah. Here comes his 3 sons and their wives. And so that's the family that God saves, and all the animals on the ark. And so by the time we get to Genesis 9 and they get off the ark, God says, okay, we're going to restart things here. And now I'm going to tell you how to behave with each other. And so he comes up with what we would call civil laws. He says, if murder occurs, this is what you're going to do. And if theft occurs, here's what you'll do. And so there's actually 7 categories of laws that God gives. We call them the Noahide laws, and that is the very first civil government. So we start with individuals, then we start with a family, then God gives us civil government. That's right up front in Genesis. And from that, everything kind of develops outward.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that when you look at government was originally designed for the preservation of rights, the preservation of life and liberty and property, things that actually in America we talk about and we try to preserve. Well, part of the reason is going back to Genesis 9, looking and saying, this is what God thought needed to be preserved in everything going on. And certainly we see that acknowledged in our Declaration and enshrined in our Constitution, kind of in our form of government. But I think it's even interesting looking at the fact that there was first the individual, then there was the family, and then came government. And this is before God's even made the institution of the church, which would seem to indicate that government is a really big deal in God's eyes.
Yeah, government is a big deal in God's eyes. And as you go through the scriptures, he develops it a whole lot more. And you find more and more details for government. And as God goes through the scriptures, by the time you get to Israel and he forms the nation, he says, okay, guys, here's your laws that'll deal with immigration and economics and education and military and everything else. God covers it all in there. And it's interesting that as he does, he also recognizes the fact that he created 4 different types of government.
And even as we say government, that would probably be also known as responsibility, where there's different responsibilities for each section, where you have responsibility for the individual, responsibility for the family, responsibility inside the government, their role. And then when the church comes along, and I guess specifically if you look in Exodus, it was the formation of the temple, but that's where you worship God, and we would kind of know that as the church. But they had a responsibility and a duty in what God created them and their purpose as well. So as we say, kind of the individual governments, also their individual responsibilities as God created them.
Yeah, when you look at the scriptures, for example, God says, raise your children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. Now, when you get a command like that, did God command the government to do that, the church to do that, the family to do that, or the individual to do that? Well, the answer is the family. That was not a command to civil government to raise our children, nurture and admonition of the Lord. And then when God says things like, for example, if someone is a murderer, they're to be dealt with, that's not a command to the individual, that's not a command to the family or the church, that's a command to civil government. So even as you look at the commands on government in the Bible, you have to say, which government is he talking to? Is this for individual self-government? Is this for the family government? Is this for the church government? Or is this for the civil government? And there's a lot of verses, but they deal with all those different four forms of government.
And this is something too, as we look at Scripture, and if we ask the question, what form of government does Scripture really lay out? What does maybe God encourage? When you go throughout the Bible, you see there's a lot of monarchs. You see, which actually, interestingly enough, when Israel wanted a king, and Samuel comes along and says, that's a terrible idea. We don't want a king. This is going to be really bad. He's going to tax you and take your sons and your daughters and your property and your livestock. This is terrible. And the Israelites said, but everybody else has a king, so we want a king. Well, clearly that wasn't God's idea, because Samuel was trying to explain to them on God's behalf, let's stay away from this. Well, before there were kings, you have Moses, and so you had prophets, you had leaders. And what's interesting, when God leads the Israelites out of Egypt, and this is another one of those kind of defining setup moments, just like after Noah was on the ark and he gets off and God says, we're going to redo interaction with people. We're going to kind of redo some of this government structure. When Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt, God is talking to a people who have been in a different nation for more than 400 years. And they've been slaves in that nation, and so they've had to learn to live according to the rules of Egypt, which were different than the rules of God. God had a different idea.
I mean, they had 400-year habit of being slaves and having a Pharaoh. And that was not God's plan for government for them. And that's why after he gets them across the Red Sea, and after he gets them delivered from Egypt with the 10 miracles, the 10 plagues, and he's got them out there at the mountain, he says, okay, I've now got your full attention. And when I have your full attention, we're going to redo government. And here's what I want. And he goes through and lays it out. And so Moses gives all these principles that God gave him off the mount. God actually writes down specific laws to guide the nation. This is something they've never experienced. It's nothing in their lifestyle. It's never happened in the world at this point in time. But God builds a nation and says, here's how you operate your nation. And it is very specific on civil laws. It is very specific on saying, here's what the temples are to do, here's what civil governments are to do, here's what families are to do, and here's what individuals are to do. So God recognizes all four even at that point in time. But that really is the genesis of what actually kind of becomes the American system. We had monarchs, and everybody in Europe seemed to have monarchs. You had the King of Italy and of France and of Spain, and you had the King of Scotland, and you had the Haitian kings and the Helvetican kings, and America comes along and says, no, we're going to be all right without a king. And they really drew that model from what you see in the book of Exodus.
Well, and as God gave laws dealing with basically every topic you can imagine, there's 613 commands in the Old Testament, and so every topic is covered. In the midst of covering all those topics, though, Moses was the main leader. Moses was the guy, and Moses was getting overwhelmed trying to handle everything. So his father-in-law, Jethro, comes along and says, Moses, what are you doing? This is not good for you or for all the people. He says, what we need to do is we need to choose out leaders from among the people. And they can be leaders of tens and 50s and hundreds and thousands. And we should choose them out and let them rule over the people. Now, it's significant. The ruling over the people was not them determining what was morally right and wrong, because God had already determined what's morally right and wrong. God had already told them this is what's right and wrong. But they needed people to help uphold those standards or teach those standards or to lead in different areas. And so when Jethro comes along and says, we need to choose out leaders from among us, this is really this notion of a Republican form of government where you choose a leader. So the people get to vote, the people get to choose, but it's the leaders who actually are the ones that are in charge of some of the enforcement of the laws, some of the operation of the laws. And again, it was significant that in the Old Testament, this wasn't them getting to determine what they thought was morally right and wrong. God had already determined what's morally right and wrong, but this was the kind of birth of what we would see as the Republican system of government. A Republican system is where you choose out leaders, and those leaders represent you to enact and enforce and kind of carry out the laws on your behalf. And as we say this, there really are lots of different forms of government.
You know, across the centuries, there have been various different forms of government that have produced widely different results, some good, some bad. What are those different forms of government? Let's take a look.